And understand it's not a sigh, it's a breath. So just breathe for a moment. And we've already shared a lot of information with you. Let's just take a moment first of all to breathe and take in what we've received. And let us go forward with the awareness that our thoughts are prayers, and that's all. And let us continue with the opening affirmation and prayer. I believe it's behind me. I am divinely guided step by step to a new and fulfilling life. And now we'll have a musical selection by Karen and Wade.
Rise and look around you.
pad thai noodles from Salad Bethesda. Maybe it's Pavlovian, I don't know. Thank you so much. What a wonderful song from a wonderful movie. A New Age movie before the New Age. Does anybody remember that one? On a Clear Day?
It's kind of a weird one, actually, don't they?
Yes, a New Age movie before the New Age. We didn't know what we were watching. Right? So let us breathe and let my sermon come up on my iPad. Just breathe for a moment. And the title of my sermon is Getting to Godville. Getting to Godville. And the essence of the sermon is based actually on a scripture. I know I quote a lot of different spiritual teachers from a lot of different traditions. Today I'm working a little bit with the Bible, where Jesus, the Christed man, said, "Know ye not that the kingdom of heaven lives within you?" And so the sermon, Getting to Godville, expounds on that a little bit, because we first ask, so what is Godville? And based on the scripture, the question I ask is, could Godville be an inner space where, despite what is going on in the outer world, we find peace? Could Godville be that inner flame, that inner golden flame within each and every one of us, that violet flame that burns eternally, that is our eternal essence, that knows and remembers that it has never been separated from God? Could Godville be that inner space where there is only love, no matter what outer experiences we have observed or participated in that may have seemed to be unloving? And if Godville is this inner place, how do we get there? How do we nurture that space so that we can use the spiritual law of inner cause and outer effect to create Godville from within, and then project that Godville out into our world so that all of our experiences outside of us match that inner experience of Godville? And how do we then maintain and sustain, first of all, that inner state that can help us to move through any outer state as if it is Godville, no matter what choices others make, or no matter what we are seeing in that moment? How can we move past what A Course in Miracles calls the illusion and stay in the truth of Godville? And now we know that there is a cottage industry that helps us to get to Godville. They sell all kinds of lotions and potions and ointments and unguents to help facilitate this journey. And that's all cool, because they do facilitate this journey. However, as we're applying the lotions and potions and ointments and unguents, let us remember that the key road to Godville takes us on a journey within. And we can get there, because the journey to Godville is simply a journey from our minds to our hearts. We who have been coming to Unity or other churches like it for quite a while, we understand spiritual truths, and our task is to continue to absorb those spiritual truths into each layer of our consciousness, because our consciousness is like an onion, and each time we hear a truth, and each time we breathe it in, and each time we practice it, and each time we live it, we are embodying it on a deeper layer and at a deeper level. So we can get there. It's just a somewhat repetitive journey that takes us deeper every day. And that's one of the keys, deeper every day. We can get there. We can sustain it. We can maintain it. We can project it. And we can live in Godville. Maybe one day we live in Godville for a 3-minute meditation. Maybe the next day we're in Godville for a 5-minute meditation. Maybe the next day we're in Godville to lunch and someone gets on our nerves. Maybe the next day we're in Godville to 2 p.m. when we crash from lunch. Maybe the next day we're in Godville till 7 o'clock p.m. until we forget. As the Course in Miracles says, let me always remember that God is with me. And sometimes, and maybe if we can remember that all day, we'll stay in Godville. We can get there. And that's what I'm here to share with you. And I know we all know this, but sometimes it takes a little reminder from outside of us. So how do we get there? How do we get to Godville? Well, the first thing that we have to do, and I'm going to repeat all three. In my church, people like to take notes. You might not find my talk noteworthy, so you don't have to, but I'm kidding. But there are 3 steps that I found for getting to Godville. Number 1, leave Meville. Number 2, move through the valley of the shadow. And number 3, move into the valley of vision. And number 4, get through the Yellow Brick Road. You probably know where the Yellow Brick Road. And you probably know where that one's going. Okay, so number 1, leave Meville. What is Meville? Meville is what A Course in Miracles calls the false ego and all of its suburbs. And let me just put this into context. There are 2 yous. There is the human you. And the human you believes itself to be human. The human you believes itself to be shaped by its experiences. The human you believes itself to be a product of economics, geography, demographics, and all of those forces outside of you, which you believe have shaped and molded you, shaped and molded your thinking, shaped and molded your walk through the world, and shaped and molded what happens to you. This is the ego, you, and the ego, me. This, A Course in Miracles tells us, is the false ego, because it has nothing to do with who we really are. And when we go into meditation and when we feel a seemingly external energy, and when we merge that seeming external energy with the internal energy, and the indwelling light within merges and fuses with what we perceive to be the light of all, that unity, the word unity, that unity causes us to transcend our limited perception of ourselves. And in that transcendent moment, and each time we take that transcendent choice, the power of our ego is diminished, and the power of our God selves is enhanced. And that's why the daily spiritual practice of being in union with the light of God and allowing the light of God within and the light of God that is all to be one is so important. Because each time we experience this unity, the power of the ego is diminished. The belief that I'm a woman, I'm a man, I'm black, I'm white, I'm straight and gay, or gay, and all these false divisions fall away. And we see within us, despite what the world has told us, we see within us innate perfection. We see within us innate love. We see within us innate beauty. We see within us the innate joy that God wills for God's beloveds, instead of the false ideas of punishment and guilt and judgment of ourselves. And when we see ourselves in this way, it becomes easier to see these things in others as well. And this is an aspect of the journey of leaving Meville, we have to leave that Meville to get to Godville. Does this make any sense? Is anybody with me?
Yes.
Now, Meville has some suburbs, right? When I was vice president of marketing, and we do market demographics and segmentation and stuff, we had these things called standard metropolitan statistical areas. And they were not only the cities, but the suburbs. And then they became megalopoli, whereas they weren't actual cities and their suburbs. They were groups of cities that had become clustered. For example, years ago, Baltimore and Washington were separate cities. But as we know now, Baltimore and Washington is one area. It's a megalopolis. And it is not one city, it is a region, the Baltimore-Washington region, because of the growth of the suburbs, right? So, Meville has some suburbs. One of the suburbs of Meville is a neighborhood called Victimhood. With me? Anybody ever drive through the neighborhood of Victimhood? And actually, oddly and interestingly enough, sometimes we get comfortable in that suburb because it helps us to believe, it's easy for us to believe that there is always something outside of us creating our experience. And it's easy then to forget that perhaps there is a part of our inner consciousness that is actually begging to be healed, that is supporting the creation of our outer experiences so that we can bring our thoughts to awareness so that we can then choose to heal them. Sometimes that's a tough pill to swallow, and it's easier to kind of believe it's something outside of us. So the question then becomes, when I am in victimhood, how do I get to Meville, to Godville, from the Meville of victimhood? A Course in Miracles, lessons 30, 31, 32, it says, I am not a victim of the world I see. There is a part of me, and note the me. There is a part of me that has lived in Meville that has constructed this experience in order that I might see the error of my thinking. And that part of me that has constructed this to see the error of my thinking is now awakened because I'm experiencing something I don't like. And therefore, I can now make a different choice with clarity. As Winston Churchill said, he said, his mother was American, nobody realizes that. But he said, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. A Course in Miracles, lesson 138 says something very similar. It says, in order to choose heaven, you must fully examine every other option first. So one of the ways that we can get from victimhood to Godville is to realize, I'm not going to judge myself for being in victimhood. I just took a wrong turn in my thinking. I'm not going to judge myself for this. I'm just examining options so I can get to Godville. And all kidding aside, when we release that judgment and see from the perspective of the light within, it's all good. There are no mistakes, and nothing is a mistake. As the Bible says, as A Course in Miracles, I get the two conflated all the time. A Course in Miracles says, know ye not that everything past, present, and to be were all gently planned by the one who would lead you to your good. And the Bible says something similar. All things work together for the good. So when we see from a different perspective, we can release ourselves from judgment, and we can release ourselves from judging ourselves for taking a detour into victimhood, and just understand that this was divinely planned to lead me to Godville. Does that make any sense? Is anybody still with me?
Yes.
All right. Then, once we understand that, we can. There's a little sub-neighborhood in the suburb called victimhood, called the projects of projection. The projects of projection. Now, does anybody here know what a housing project is?
Oh, yes.
I grew up in one. It wasn't a pleasant experience. And the projects of projection is equally unpleasant. It keeps us projecting our stuff out onto other people as opposed to owning it. But if we want to get to Godville, we have to leave the projects of projection and realize this is something that I, in my infinite power and wisdom, have created to lead me to the light. And if I have created this, man, I'm powerful. And if I were to create consciously, instead of creating unconsciously, just imagine what I could create. If I could become aware of all this unconscious stuff going on within me, and if I could just turn that around, just imagine how powerful I would be to create my good. If I can create all this mess I see outside of me. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So we can move out of that project of projection. And in order to move out of the project of projection, we have to make a choice. We get to a junction called choice. And that choice is judgment junction. Do I judge this, or do I instead choose to see it as an opportunity for choice? Now, we're always judging because that's our default state. But instead of judging where we are, instead of judging where the world is, instead of judging all the things we see outside of us, instead of judging everything in our past, because how many of us take our inventory every day of all the mistakes we have made, and then we beat ourselves up, and before we get out of the door, we've already lost the journey. Amen? I'm not supposed to say amen here, sorry. How many of us have done that? But each moment and each breath offers us a choice. Each moment and each breath is a choice. Whether we judge or whether we move past judgment junction to say, okay, this is what it is, which is a way of saying, I accept this for what it is, and now I accept a new thought instead that can change what this is. I will go within. I will look at the sponsoring thought that has supported the creation of this external experience, and if I don't like the external experience, I can change the sponsoring thought, and I can allow, ask, and invite the light and love of God within me to change me, to heal me, to transform me, and to lift from me that sponsoring thought. Is anybody with me?
Yes.
So we move out of the whole neighborhood. We avoid Blame Street. Anybody ever like being on Blame Street? We don't like to admit it, but sometimes it's more fun to be on Blame Street. But we move out of the whole neighborhood. But when we move out of the whole neighborhood, something very interesting happens. There's this period called the void. And in the Bible, the 23rd Psalm said, "Yea, though I move through the valley of the shadow." There's this area when we move out of Meville where we're not yet into Godville. And that can sometimes be a little bit challenging for us because things aren't as they were and things aren't as they are to be. And that's when God is creating an omelet. I'm going to tell this story very, very quickly because I'm looking at the clock. But you know you have an omelet, right? An omelet begins as a thought. It's 8:30 and I'm hungry. That's how an omelet begins. It's 8:30 and I'm hungry. But I've got to be to Unity at 11 o'clock and I'm going from a different direction in a different car without GPS. And so, in that God thought, we think, I think I'll make an omelet. And that's Meville, because Godville is saying, why don't you just have a power drink and get going? All kidding aside. So there's a divine thought, and this is a metaphor for everything that happens. We have a divine thought. Quite often we ignore the divine thought. I ignore the divine thought. So then you see the eggs, you see the peppers, you see the ham, you see the cheese. You bring it all out and you set it on your nice granite counter. You crack the eggs, you chop the onions, You chop up the ham, you tear up the cheese, because I use Sargento. And then you heat the pan, you put it in the pan, it sizzles, you smell it. And then you look back at your counter and you say, this counter is a mess. I've got egg on the counter, and you know egg creates salmonella. I've got all this stuff and I'm running out of time, and it's a mess. And the omelet is not yet done. So you look at all this mess and you say, what a mess. And God says, that mess is a divine mess in order to create something new. And then once you get the omelet, you start eating that bad boy, and it tastes so good. And then the mess was worth it, all right? So when we move through the valley of the shadow, we understand that the mess was worth it, because the omelet to come is going to be so wonderful. Is anybody with me?
Yes.
So how do we get hungry too, I bet? I bet some of you made a different choice and didn't eat your omelet this morning. And here I am rubbing it in your face. So how do we move through the valley of the shadow and get to God? Number one, we understand that the shadow is just a shadow. There's this phrase, scared of a shadow. And it means that someone is scared of something that is not really real. They're scared of an illusion. And many of these things we hold in our minds are just illusions. I'm afraid of what people are going to think of me. And basically, people aren't even thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves. I'm afraid, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if that happens? How many times have we spent so much energy worrying about being afraid of this, afraid of that, afraid of this, afraid of that, and none of it ever happens, and we wasted all that time and all that energy? Or the shadow of the past, where we judge ourselves about the past. What if the past were written in disappearing ink, and it doesn't matter? What if the only thing that matters is this moment of now? The past is an illusion, the future is yet to be, and if we let the light of God in, the light of God can move to us and through us and create and project a totally different trajectory than the past would indicate. What if the moment of now was the only thing there was? Those are thoughts that can help us move through the valley of shadow. It's just a shadow. It is not real. And we have to continue going to God. God, heal my thoughts. God, heal my mind. God, let me be still and listen to the truth, which is a lesson in the Course in Miracles as well. I will be still and listen to your truth instead of listening to all these things careening around in my mind, all these thoughts of the past, all these fears of the future. God, I will be still and listen to your truth. And in that stillness, God will lead us out of the valley of the shadow. For God speaks to us every day. And God speaks to us every time we sit and listen. And the more we sit, the more we listen, the more we feel, and the more we trust the light of God to lead us out of the shadow. And when the light of God leads us out of the shadow, then we can go from the shadow of the valley of illusion to the valley of vision. God will place a new vision in our minds. God, what is your vision? God, what is your view for my life? God, what is your will for me? And just a little Cliff Notes cheat sheet. God's will for us all is perfect happiness. Of course, in those lessons 101 through 103, God's will for us is perfect happiness. For we are extensions and expressions of God, and God, being love, is happiness. So God wills for us to be the happiness that God is. For when we are the lights of happiness, when we are the lights of joy, when we are the lights of truth, when we are the lights of optimism, when we are the lights of peace, when we are the lights of grace, that light shines. And it draws others to the innate light within them and their own innate grace and their own innate lovability and their own innate light. And that's why God's will for us is perfect happiness, as opposed to the false idea that we were separate from God, that we must atone for our sins, and that we must make our way back to God, like that song, I'm Making My Way Back to You, by being forgiven for our sins. What if we were created perfect, whole, and complete? We judged ourselves, punished ourselves, and realized now that we don't have to do that anymore, for the light of God reminds us that we are perfect, whole, and complete, just as we are, and that punishment need not be. Amen? So we go to the valley of vision. God, what is your vision for me today? God, what is your vision for me now? God, what do you see in me that you would have me share with my brothers and sisters? God, how does your light want to shine within me now? God, what would your light transform within me now? God, how would your light express through me now? For I am simply an extension and vessel of your light, awaiting your instruction to express your truth in a way that is for the greatest good. That's the valley of vision. And when we get that vision, receive that vision, trust that vision, allow that vision, step forward with that vision, we can't go wrong. Our ego mind would want to say, what if I fail? But the God mind would say, what if I succeed? Anybody here remember an old book from the 70s, Jane Roberts' Seth Material, The Nature of Personal Reality? Yes. Well, there was a section in that book that talked about how our human ego mind automatically works. That when God places a vision in our minds, our ego seizes it and looks back at the past and all the reasons and ways based on our human database that this will fail. And then we say, what if I fail? Our task is to say, what if I succeed? And allow God's vision of success to take form. And that little shift, when we get to that judgment junction, that little shift offers us a vision of success, and it offers us the will and the power and the grace and the insights and the support that God is always pouring into us, because then we are open to it. What if I succeed instead? And we look for the branches. We look for the branches. And this actually does come from the Bible. I keep telling myself I'm going to preach from the Bible, but all other kinds of sacred texts move in as well. But this actually does come from the Bible. Anybody remember Noah's Ark? The first thing they found was branches. And that was an indication that there was land. At first, our full vision may or may not become manifest, but we may get a hint. We may get some sort of confirmation. We may get some sort of affirmation. Now, our human ego mind will think, well, that's not enough and I failed. But maybe that's just a hint, just like that bird brought that branch to the ship to let them know that you may not see it, but there is a promised land. Does that make any sense? Yeah. And just like the Israelites had to run around in the desert for 40 years eating manna from heaven, which actually scientists said was bird poop. You gotta lighten up a sermon. The manna from heaven, it was bird poop. It dropped down and it had nutrients in it, so that while they were in the middle of the desert wandering around, they had the nutrients that they needed. All kidding aside. But while we are wandering, we are day by day, moment by moment, healing layers and levels of our consciousness. And each time we have an experience, let us not become distracted. Let us not become discouraged. Let us understand this is an aspect of my consciousness that comes up for healing. This is God's grace in action. This is not evidence of my failure. This is evidence that I am moving forward. This is evidence of God's grace leading me out of the valley of the shadow and leading me to God's vision for me, which is perfect happiness. And when we understand and hold on to God's vision, we move down, let's call it that yellow brick road, where all of the things that we believe are barriers present themselves so that they might be overcome, and we realize what we knew all along. Just like Dorothy Gale had the power within her to get home with the power of her thoughts, we have the power to get to Godville immediately. We just have to practice being there with our daily spiritual practice. We have to practice being there with a deepening awareness and relationship of God's presence at all times. We have to practice being there by allowing God in. God, I let you into this internal place where there has been doubt. God, I let you into this internal place where there has been fear. God, I let you into this internal place where there has been a vision of failure instead of vision of success. God, I let you in to this internal place where there has been judgment. And God, I let you in that your light and love may express through me. And this daily spiritual practice of letting God in, remembering God's presence, practicing God's presence, and living in God's grace gets us to Godville. For a moment, for a minute, for an hour, for a day, for a week, for a year, and for an eternity. Turning that namaste moment into a namaste week, to a namaste month, and a namaste life. So the simple essence of this message is, what is our daily spiritual practice and how can we enhance it to get to Godville, to have our namaste life? And whatever it is for you and whatever works for you, Godspeed on your journey. Have your namaste life, getting to Godville. So thank you very much.